We're starting a series this morning called Believe, talking about rational and scientific evidence for faith in God. Kind of a unusual. It'll be an unusual series. It'll be 3 weeks, but it will. What's unusual about it is we're really going to talk about God without appealing a lot to the Bible, right? Because we want for people who don't have faith, who don't accept Jesus or haven't accepted Jesus as Lord, to see if there are some reasons outside of Scripture, outside of the religious context for believing in God. I have a bibliography in there this morning. That's kind of unusual. Don't usually run a bibliography with a series, but these are books that I recommend for you if you want to study further. They are excellent. I haven't read all of them. I've read most of them. In fact, right now I'm in the middle of reading the one by Peter Hitchens, which I was attracted to that one. I think that one is... Oh, I don't know, you got it in there. Something about how my journey from atheism to faith and Rage Against God, I think is it. And he was a Bible-burning atheist. He is a British journalist who, I think this is his first religious book to have written, which is really just sharing his personal story. Mostly what he writes are history books about England. What's most interesting about Peter is perhaps his brother is Christopher Hitchens, who is an outspoken, or what has been an outspoken atheist for many years, and I believe passed away recently. But anyway, so bibliography, check that stuff out. If one of those kind of looks like it might be interesting to you, the Francis Collins stuff is excellent. Renowned scientist who talks about how he sees God in DNA and in the basic chemical structures of the universe. But here we go. If the claims of Christianity are true, then objective moral values exist. If the claims of Christianity are true, then your life has significance. If the claims of Christianity are true, then there is purpose for your life. If the claims of Christianity are true, then there is hope even in the midst of aging, of sickness, and death. If the claims of Christianity are true, then you have an opportunity in the here and now to develop a relationship with the God of the universe and to experience everlasting life with the God of the universe. And I say all of that just to say, I'm not saying those claims are true. I'm saying if they're true, all of that is true. And what that means is we can't ignore the question of God's existence, because the importance, the consequences of that question are just too important on a massive scale. And because of the impact that these Christian claims can have on us, it is essential to find out whether or not they are true. It would be foolish to ignore the question of the existence of God and the truth of these claims. Now, if God does not exist, then life here is futile, absurd, really, without meaning. Man, writes Lauren Isley, is the cosmic orphan, the only creature in the universe who asks why. All other animals have instincts to guide them, but man has learned to ask questions. Isley says, who am I? Man asks. Why am I here? Where am I going? Since the Enlightenment, when he threw off the shackles of religion, man has tried to answer these questions without reference to God, but the answers that came back were not exhilarating, but dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature, a result of matter plus time plus chance. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death. If there is no God, then you and I are nothing but clumps of matter hurled together by the forces of time and nature, here today, gone tomorrow. William Lane Craig wrote about this absurdity of human existence if there is no God. He wrote, "The contributions of the scientist to the advance of human knowledge, the researches of the doctor to alleviate pain and suffering, the efforts of the diplomat to secure world peace, the sacrifices of good people everywhere to better the lot of the human race, all of these come to nothing. This is the horror of modern man. because he ends in nothing. He is nothing. But let's be clear about it. None of this is an argument for the existence of God, right? None of this even makes it more probable that God exists, all right? This just says the question matters. The question is one of great importance. So here's the thing. It is a question, because of all of this, it is a question that rational people cannot shrug off. It is a question that demands an answer. Outspoken atheist and scientist, you probably heard of him, Richard Dawkins, puts it like this as he looks out at the natural world. He says, "There is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being." And if there is no God, Richard Dawkins is absolutely right. Now here's the thing. Even if you could live forever, all right? Even if doctors in science someday discover some potion that you can take that will give you immortality, there still would not be meaning without the existence of God. If the universe existed forever, and if you were to exist forever, your life still would not have significance without God. There's a science fiction story that's told of an astronaut who finds herself stranded on some rock in the middle of space, abandoned, no chance of rescue. There she is alone on this rock. And this astronaut has two vials, two containers. Right? One of them contains poison that will instantly kill her. The other container, the other vial, contains this potion that will give her immortality. She will live forever. Realizing the hopelessness and the absurdity of her situation, she takes that vial of poison and she consumes it. And then to her horror, she realizes she had taken the wrong vial. And from that point, she is doomed to exist forever and ever, a meaningless, unending life. If God doesn't exist, then that is more or less our situation. We can deceive ourselves and imagine that there is meaning. We can try to manufacture some sort of meaning, but it's really an illusion. Not even immortality would give significance to life. But if God does exist, then immortality is real for us, and so is meaning. And so either there is real meaning or there is not real meaning. If God exists, then there is. That's why this question matters. That's why so many are asking it, because it is of vital importance to us. Now, before we get started, let's just define a couple of terms, words that you may hear, and I just want you to know kind of what they mean as we work through them. First, theism. Theism, Theism, theism. This just means the belief in God, all right? A theist is someone who believes in God. Now, you probably know this better in terms of atheism, all right? So the theist believes in God. Atheist does not believe in God, does not believe that there is a supreme being that exists, all right? Agnostic, I'm not going to talk much about that. That's someone who says, I don't know. The reason we're not going to talk much about the agnostic is either theism is correct or atheism is correct, all right? Either A, there is a God, or B, there is not a God, all right? There's not a middle ground. God doesn't sort of exist, all right? Either there is or is not a God. Now, the other thing I would mention is what I would call the practical atheist, right? The practical atheist is the woman or man who claims to believe in God, to have faith in God, but it produces no measurable impact on their life, right? They don't love their spouse anymore because of their faith. They don't care for the poor anymore because of their faith. They don't care for the environment anymore because of their faith. They don't live any differently because of their faith. This is the practical atheist. They claim a faith, but they live as if there is no God. And I would suggest, at least in my opinion, this is the worst of all scenarios. Better to be an atheist than to be a practical atheist. Better to not believe in God than to believe in God. It makes absolutely no difference whatsoever to your life. Now, let me share a little bit of my own background, just quickly. I've always been drawn to the big picture. That's good in some ways and bad in other ways. I'm not a detail-oriented person. I like the big questions. I like the big ideas. And that's why when I was an undergraduate and took that undergraduate philosophy class that all undergraduates had to take, I loved it. I loved it so much that at that point I was like, this is what I'm going to do, all right? This is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. I'm going to go get my master's degree, my Ph.D., and I am going to talk about this stuff, read this stuff, write about this stuff, dialogue with my colleagues about this stuff for the rest of my natural days because I really enjoyed it so much. And so I started doing graduate work in philosophy. And I'll tell you this, some good Christian people who cared very deeply about me were scared. They're like, oh no, he's going to go off to this graduate philosophy department and he's going to lose his faith. His heart is going to wander away from Jesus, or at least that is a strong possibility, they thought. And so they were very concerned about it. They were right about one thing. The philosophy department at the University of Oklahoma, the graduate department, was not exactly friendly toward faith, all right? It was not exactly friendly toward faith. My beliefs were stretched. My beliefs were certainly challenged. My doctoral dissertation was titled Describing God, all right? That was the dissertation, Describing God. And I didn't try to describe God, but what the dissertation was about was, can we speak intelligibly about God? Right? If he is a transcendent being, if he is beyond our capacity to understand and know, then how can we even talk about him? And so that was what my dissertation was back. And after I looked back on my experience in graduate school, I found that my faith had grown. It hadn't shrunk. And let me explain a little bit why. I mean, for one thing, I'd seen in 2,500 years of philosophical writings that we studied, and in the lives of the real men and women that were my colleagues, I discovered that there is an absurdity without God. That meaning has to be a purely human construct, something that we've made up, that we've devised to kind of fool ourselves so that we can make it through our 70, 80 years without committing suicide, right? So I kind of saw that there is nothing, if you don't believe in God, that gives true, objective meaning toward life. And then I saw in my studies, because philosophy was really the first university discipline. I'm going to defend my discipline here. It was really the first, right? It's the oldest and the first. And out of philosophy sprung mathematics. Out of philosophy sprung science. Out of philosophy sprung aesthetics. And so the underpinnings of mathematics are started in philosophy. The underpinnings of science started with philosophy of science and so forth. Even art and beauty and music. The understanding of what is beauty started in philosophy, and certainly that was interesting to me as I studied those foundations. The most compelling, the most moving area for me in terms of bringing me toward faith and not away from faith, because I asked some serious questions back in those days, was the area of ethics, right? The philosophy of ethics. And we're going to spend some time in just a couple of minutes looking at an argument for God's existence from this area, from ethics this morning. But before we go there, let me just say what I think is pretty obvious. Most people don't come to faith in God because of some philosophical argument, right? Most people don't come to faith in God because they've looked through a microscope and decided there must be a God. That's not most people's faith story, although it is some people's faith story. Most people come to faith in God because they have either personally experienced God's power in their lives, and they can't deny it. It's real for them. They've experienced it. Or they come to faith in God because they have seen His power at work in the lives of family members and friends. They've seen the before and after picture of people they care about. Before addicted, after freed. Before marriage in shambles, after marriage strong. And so they come to faith in God because they see that sort of empirical evidence in the lives of their friends and people they care about. Others come to faith in God because they read the Bible and they sense the Spirit speaking to them through the Bible, they find out that when they apply the truths that they read about in Scripture, that it really does change their life. And so they come to faith in God. And that may be where you're at today in one of those categories. You don't really care much about these questions we're going to talk about. I mean, you know God, you love God, you don't feel like you need this stuff, and that's fine. That's great. But I'll tell you, it's still important that you know why you believe what you believe, and it is still important that you are able to articulate that to someone who doesn't share your faith. If we care about people, and God cares about people, if we care about people who don't believe, if we love unbelievers just as we love believers, then we owe it to them to present a case for God in language that they can understand. And so church, folks, it's not a place where we turn our brains off. Church is not a place where we do that, where we have to check out intellectually. It's a place where we open up. It's a place where we engage these grand questions that people have been talking about for thousands of years. It's a place where we have these conversations and where we honestly consider how to deepen our thinking. And as a believer, that is part of your worship to God. It's actually part of your worship. Remember when Jesus was asked, what's the most important commandment? Mark chapter 12, verse 30, Jesus says, it is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength. Your mind. Loving God with your mind, your understanding, your intellect. Your mind is an instrument that you use to express your love for God. And so if we are to be a kingdom people, one way that we show our love for God and one way that we show our love for people who do not yet believe in God or know God is to train our minds, to prepare ourselves to share precisely why we believe. 1 Peter 3:15 says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason. The word Greek there for reason is apologia, all right? We'll talk about that in a minute. To give a reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect. That is so powerful. So when we share our faith, it is always with respect for the other person, respect for what they believe, with gentleness, with humility, with love, with the heart of Christ. But we also share a reason, an apologia. That word here is translated as reason. In Greek, apologia may look like apology. Really what it means in Greek is an explanation or an argument. And certainly part of this can be your personal story. Obviously, part of your testimony, a very important part of your testimony is this is what God has done in my life. Here's how He's worked in my life. That's part of your testimony. But there are reasons to believe in God without appealing to personal experiences, and these reasons can help you in a dialogue with someone that flat out doesn't believe, that will allow them to have some solid intellectual grounds to take that first step of faith, to move towards a relationship with God. So finally, apologetics, which comes from this word apologia. Apologetics is the study of arguments for the existence of God. And I think it can be important to you, while it may not be today, it can be important to you because at some point you're likely to have some life crises. You're likely to hit a place where your faith is really going to be put through the ringer. And at a time like that, it would be pretty handy to have something beyond just emotion to tie your faith onto, something more substantial when you struggle. And so hopefully what we do over the next few weeks will help you to have that. So, next week we're going to talk about a strong argument, a strong apologia for the existence of God from the nature of the universe. And the third week we'll do some more science stuff. And then the third week, the evening, we're going to have Peter J. Williams, who's been here with us a couple times before from Cambridge. Dr. Williams will be sharing with us as we close out on Sunday night, the third week. All right. Does God exist? Where does the evidence point? Now, if you consider the nature of morality, back to this field of ethics, if you consider the nature of morality, then you're going to find pretty strong reasons to believe in the existence of God. And let me share with you this morning just something you can tuck away, something you can carry with you, a pretty simple little argument that is quite strong that comes from the nature of morality. Now, when we look at arguments, when we think about arguments, here's a little terminology for you today. An argument has to be valid before it is sound, all right? Validity has nothing to do with whether an argument is true or not. It just means that formally it's correct, all right? From the premises, the conclusion must necessarily follow. If that's true, the argument is valid. Doesn't mean it's true, right? A sound argument is one that is true. That means that the premises are true, therefore the conclusion that follows is true as well. So here goes, let's put the slide up for the argument from morality for God's existence. Number one, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2, objective moral values do exist. 3, therefore, God exists. Again, this is valid, all right? People who understand how a deductive syllogism works will go, yeah, that's a valid argument. They may not believe it's true, but it's certainly valid. The soundness comes down to whether the first two premises are actually true. So here goes. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. 2, objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, 3, God exists. Now, one reason this argument is so powerful is because almost everybody is going to agree with the first premise. And really, we're going to talk about this in a minute. They may not think at first blush, but really, when you have a conversation, you'll find out they believe the second premise. And if the first is true and the second is true, then the third is necessarily true. Now, the first one, either you believe in God or you say, hey, I'm okay, I don't believe in God, but I'm okay with moral relativism. I mean, I believe in right and wrong, but it's kind of a relative thing. And so most people believe that's true because they believe in one of those two hypotheses. Either they have this strong set of moral values they believe to be true, objectively, independently of the situation, or they believe that it is categorically wrong to impose your values on someone else. Either way, you agree with objective morality because either way you have this strong sense of right and wrong, even if you just think it's very wrong to put your values on somebody else. But if you believe that first premise and you believe the second premise, then God is necessarily, as a consequence, exists. So, the first premise, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Is that true? Well, certainly historically, value systems have been based on the highest good, right, from the Greeks to today. The highest good, namely God. Now, if you take God out of the equation, what is it that is holding up morality, right? If there is no God, what is it objectively, besides just what we think or feel or vote on, what is it that holds up the right and the wrong, the good and the bad? If you appeal to science, you're not going to be satisfied because science is morally neutral, right? Science is morally neutral. You can take science and use it to do good or to do evil. It's information, it's data, but it is morally neutral. You're not going to find your values under a microscope. That's not to demean science. Every discipline has its importance. It's incredibly important, right? I want to go to a doctor that has a great understanding of science. Don't get me wrong. But I'm not going to find my values under that. So can objective moral values exist without God? Now don't get confused here. You may be thinking, look, I'm a good person, but I don't believe in God. I don't believe in God, but I still think I try to do good. I try to avoid evil. And if that's what you think, you're kind of missing the point. I mean, that's fine to think that, but you're kind of missing the point. The point is, it's not belief in God that holds up morality. It's not your belief in God, it's God Himself who holds up morality. So God is the foundation of morality. Unless you believe that morality is an illusion, that we kind of get to make up our own set of rules about right and wrong, unless you believe that, then there has to be some sort of stopping point. some foundational place that we land, and God is that grounding, is that ultimate reality that gives us a grounding, a solid foundation for morality. Now, if God doesn't exist, neither do objective moral values. Okay, that's the first premise. It's one which most unbelievers will accept readily. They're not okay with God existing, but they're certainly okay with some sort of moral relativism. Or are they? That brings you to premise 2. Do objective moral values and duties exist? And so almost everybody says one is true, believe in God or believe in moral relativism. Is premise 2 true, that objective morals and values exist? This is where folks are going to point their finger and say, that one is not true. All right, that one is not true. Folks may think premise 2 is false at first blush, but almost no one thinks it's false after they consider it. So you don't believe in moral absolutes. So you don't believe that moral values and duties actually exist. Really? Rape? Morally wrong. I bet you agree with that. Child abuse? Morally wrong. I bet you agree with that. And if you agree with that, you agree in objective moral values. How about the atrocities committed in the name of religion? How about boys being abused by priests in the Catholic Church and then the subsequent cover-up by the Catholic Church? I bet you agree that those are issues dealing with right and wrong, and there's a pretty clear answer there. The Bible teaches that whether you are a believer or whether you are an unbeliever, then God has burned onto the hard drive of your heart. That's my language, not the Bible's language, okay? But God has burned objective moral values onto your heart. Romans chapter 2, verses 14 and 15, they talk about this. Now, and this is what happens around the table in the lunchroom of the philosophy department, okay? You run into some hardcore skeptics, moral skeptics, who will refuse to acknowledge, for the sake of argument, will refuse to acknowledge that anything is objectively, morally wrong. Child abuse, racism, whatever. These folks are very rare to find. Like I said, you're going to find the highest densely populated areas in lunchrooms and philosophy departments. And honestly, I strongly suspect, because I know these guys and these gals, I strongly suspect that they're making a point for argument's sake that they don't actually believe in, all right? If someone holds that extreme position, right, that there are no rights and there are no wrongs when you come down to it, objective morality doesn't exist, then I suppose you could punch them in the face. And if they don't say anything, if they just stand there, you can punch them again. And I bet you eventually, they may throw a couple punches too, but eventually they're going to say, why did you do that? That was wrong. That's not right. And you can say, well, I did it as a pedagogical tool to show that you really do not believe in your own relativist position. Now, I'm not recommending that. I'm certain Jesus would not recommend that either. Not exactly the turn the other cheek philosophy, but I think you get the point. Most folks who defend moral relativism, almost all of them are really engaging in some sort of rhetorical gamesmanship or some sort of debate strategy, when in actuality they have pretty hard and fast, pretty clear notions of what's right and wrong and not negotiable to them or anyone at any time in any place. A person can claim to be a relativist, but I promise you, if you attack some value that they hold dear, they will not maintain that their value is merely a personal preference. If you tell them, hey, I think racism is okay. I think child pornography is good. I think destroying the environment is terrific. At some point, you're going to hit something they care very deeply about. And they're going to argue with you, and they're going to show that no, those things are right, those things are wrong, no matter who you are, no matter when you live. Those values are not determined by what the majority says in some sort of vote. They're not determined, spousal abuse is wrong whether the majority decides it's okay or not. And there certainly are these moral absolutes that are not a project of our biology, not a product of some sort of evolutionary development, not going to find these moral values under a microscope. In fact, many times, doing what's right is actually opposed to evolutionary survival. Many times doing what's right, altruism, is going to call you to do something that can actually be harmful to you, to put your life or your family at risk so that you can do something that's right and needs to be done. Now, the most rational explanation, the best explanation, is that this comes from the character of God. As Genesis chapter 1 says, you and I are made in the image of God, whether you believe in God or not. That's just what I'm just saying. That's what Genesis 1 says, that we're made in the image of God. Romans 2:14, we talked about already, says that He has burned onto the hard drives of our hearts this concept of right and wrong, whether we believe in Him or not. They're written into our hearts. They're born into us as we come into existence. So the fact that we know what is right and what is wrong is wired into our systems and is a powerful reason for believing in God. Now, probably the most common counter argument to this is, hey, go to different cultures. You'll find different ideas about what is right and wrong in different cultures. Actually, sociologists have looked at this, theologians have looked at this. Start in theology. In 1993, Hans Küng, world-renowned theologian, had this conference, almost a parliament of world religions. And he had Christians, and he had Muslims, and he had Jews, and he had Buddhists, and he had Hindus gathered together, and others gathered together, and they came up with this declaration of their common beliefs and values that were represented in all of these faiths that were really in common. For example, all major world faiths have some version of the golden rule. All of them do. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Across religions, across cultures, across continents, across centuries, there's this stunning common moral sense that you can see. Donald Brown, who's a professor out in California of human anthropology, did research a few years back and published a book called The Human Universals. And his research showed that there are a variety of common moral beliefs shared by all known cultures. We had an interesting experiment, is not the right word for this, but I can't come up with a better one. But the 20th century was an interesting illustration in morality, a real case study, because really for the first time that we have a lot of evidence on, for the first time we had major world powers function systemically under the banner of atheism, all right? In the 20th century we did. Functioning to build a society that did not have God as a foundation, in fact, did not even believe in the existence of God. In the last century, you had these powerful atheist regimes in China and in Russia. You had Nazi Germany that persecuted the church. All of these governments managed to wipe out human beings in astronomical numbers in just a few decades. I mean, the numbers differ. The estimates differ, right? Most folks think that Stalin's regime took out about 20 million people. We're not talking about the war. We're not talking about World War, but just in terms of extermination, about 20 million people. Chairman Mao, some estimate Chairman Mao annihilated his regime around 70 million, but some Chinese scholars think it's much lower than that. It doesn't really matter that much. There were millions and millions of people killed in that regime. Hitler, I guess, is the bronze medalist. A distant third, responsible for around 10 million deaths to his regime. Now, some retort, well, okay, what about all the evil that religion has done, right? In the name of God. What about the wars and the atrocities done in the name of God? And sadly, it is the case that there have been some terrible things done in the name of God. And this gets kind of weird. I'm sorry. It gets a little weird here, but just for the sake of comparison, even if you were to to start adding up body counts here. If you were to look at the body count from the Crusades, from the witch burnings, and the Inquisition, over 500 years, you'll come up with about 200,000 deaths. All right? A fraction of a percentage point of what atheist regimes last century were able to do in just a few decades. Back to the simple argument. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. The argument is formally valid. The premises hold true, and so it is sound. That means it is a true argument for the existence of God. Now, I told you about a fictional story of an astronaut stranded on a rock out in the middle of space. Let me tell you about a true story of an astronaut, which I read this week. I thought was fascinating, and I had never heard this story before, and I verified it. It's really true. It happened. July 20th, 1969, just a month after I was born. That was the day, many of you remember this day, that was the day that man landed on the moon. Human beings landed on the surface of the moon, and it was a historical day. It was an internationally recognized day as being incredibly important. The whole world remembers the occasion. What most people don't know, and what NASA did not identify or even talk about, was that the astronaut Buzz Aldrin celebrated the Lord's Supper on the surface of the moon. Aldrin was an elder at his church in Texas, Presbyterian Church. Knowing that he would soon be doing something unprecedented in human history, he wanted to celebrate that occasion by calling on his Lord Jesus Christ. And so the astronaut, Buzz Aldrin, carried with him a small vial containing the wine and the sacramental wafer. He took them out of Earth's orbit onto the surface of the moon. And in an interview, here's what Aldrin talked about when he shared the story. He said, "In the radio blackout, I opened the little plastic packages which contained the bread and the wine. I poured the wine into the chalice our church had given me. In the 1/6 gravity of the moon, the wine slowly curled and gracefully came up the side of the cup. Then I read the scripture from John's Gospel. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whosoever abides in me will bring forth much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." He recalled, "I gave thanks for the intelligence and spirit that had brought 2 young pilots to the sea of tranquility. It was interesting for me to think, the first liquid ever poured on the moon and the very first food eaten here, they were the communion elements." This morning, there are a lot of people here who no doubt have different views on God, different levels of faith or lack of faith in God. Some of us here today are very connected with Christ. We believe. You've given your lives to Him totally. You know that apart from Him, you can do nothing. You're connected to Him. You believe. Okay. Others here today, a lot of us probably, I suspect, have some doubts mixed in there. Some unbelief and some belief. And yes, they can exist in the same heart at the same time. Remember Peter? Stepping out of that boat on the Sea of Galilee, there's Jesus. I believe. Throws his feet over the side, steps onto that water, then he doesn't believe so much, right? And starts to sink. And Jesus rescues him. Belief and unbelief. Remember, in Mark chapter 9, the father who has the son that's being tormented, and he brings that son to Jesus, and Jesus says, "Do you believe?" to the father? And the father says, "I believe." Remember in verse 24? "I believe, help my unbelief." I believe and I don't believe. I believe, but I'm wrestling with doubts. And Jesus loved Peter, and Jesus loved this man, and He cares even today for all of us, no matter where your faith is at, all right? And if you're here this morning, and honestly, you have a lot more unbelief than you do belief in your heart, I'm so glad that you're with us. It says that you're seeking. It says that you're asking some good questions. It says that you're pondering these matters in your heart, in your mind. Keep asking these questions. Keep seeking. And our prayer is that you will find reasons to believe, that you will experience the power of Christ in your life, and that you will see and feel in a tangible sense, in a real way, the love that God has for you through the believers here in this Christian family. And if you want to have conversations about what you're thinking, about what you're struggling with, I would love to talk with you. I'd love to Facebook with you, email with you, or just have a conversation with you and talk about that and hear what's going on. If you're at a point today where you want to give your life to Christ, you're ready to cross that line of faith and plant the flag and declare, I believe, you can do that today and talk with us as well about what you need to do to make that faith step. However you need to respond to God. Let's stand together. Let's praise His name.